I'm so excited for the discussion today around why language matters when we talk about development of digital endpoints and other digital capabilities. Before we dive into the discussion, I do want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. First off, don't worry, we'll be recording this. So if you didn't catch it at the start, it will be available on our website. So go ahead and check that out under the DIME webinar section. You'll be able to see the slides as well as the recording. In addition, we will have a Q&A section during this discussion. So if you do have any questions, please either raise your hand in the reactions tab and we'll be able to unmute you to allow you to ask your question live. Or if you're not able to ask your question live, feel free to type your question into the chat box and we'll get onto it as soon as we can. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I have the exciting job of introducing our two esteemed moderators of this session. Jen Goldsack and Lada Lanes. They are excellent and you'll be in good hands. So excited to welcome them to the stage. Jen, do you want to get started and share a brief introduction here?
Of course I can. So hi everyone, Jen Goldsack, CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. First of all, if this is your first DIME webinar, welcome. Delighted to have you here today. And what Lada and I will do is a quick opening remarks from each of us. I'll go first, then Lada. Then we're going to introduce our panelists for today and get the conversation started. So for folks who may not know DIME, we are a global nonprofit. Our mission is to advance the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital technologies to redefine healthcare and improve lives. Now, we're still a reasonably young organization, but what I believe has set us apart in terms of our impact on the field has been how we've positioned ourselves in the market, really sitting at the intersection of the two communities who must work together in order for the digitization of healthcare to be successful. And what that has required as we sit at this intersection of healthcare and technology is establishing a shared, unifying common language to support our collaboration. There's a bad joke in there somewhere about, a regulator, a clinical scientist, and an engineer walk into a bar and, they all start talking about validation and they're talking about something different. It's absolutely critical that we establish a way to communicate with one another. And until we do that and have that shared unifying language, we will endlessly be in a cycle of churn, and we will be taking too long to realize the promise of the digitization of healthcare and research. So as I said, DIME's been around for 4.5 years or so now, and in that time we've created several hundred open access resources, which I'm incredibly proud of. We also have a thriving education arm in the Digital Medicine Academy, and along the way we've always built individual glossaries at the project level, so on a particular subtopic, and appended that to a set of resources. But if we move to the next slide, what I'm excited to share with you today is that we realize that in the same way that we can't silo knowledge or have, independent languages that different collaborators speak, we also need to create a resource for the field where all of the terms that you need to be comfortable with in order to successfully advance the digitization of healthcare to improve lives needs to be available in a one-stop shop. So what you can see here on your screen is the DIME glossary, which is available open access, very easy to search. It is alphabetized and may have some of the traits that we know and love from the FDA NIH BEST glossary, really trying to keep people comfortable as we introduce this new lexicon. And what I'm also really proud of is that we haven't taken a US focus to this glossary. In the same way that we need to be able to communicate across stakeholder groups, we also need to be able to collaborate internationally. And that's a wonderful segue to ask my fellow moderator for today, my friend and collaborator, Lada, to introduce herself and talk about some of the ways the DIME glossary has dovetailed and the work that we've done to build this out alongside and in lockstep with the EFPIA glossary.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome also everybody from my side. As you say, what a better way to show that this is an international collaboration than this very webinar with these two organizations, DIME and EFPIA, together, as well as regulators from both sides of the of both continents. So I'm really excited to be here representing the EFPIA team. I'm Lada Leyens. I'm working in regulatory at Roche. But the team that I'm representing here is a fantastic team that has looked into digital endpoint topic in Europe, and as Jen said, complements nicely and builds on the work that DIME has done. We both recognized that there were gaps and that it was really important to address this topic, and then we came together to do this webinar. So fantastic example of collaboration square, I would say. As I said, the EFPIA team got together 2 years ago to start looking at digital endpoint gaps and questions in Europe, and was very active with different streams. A workshop was organized last year. Many of you were involved. And the very piece of work that we're talking about today is on lexicon. So we also got together to start talking about why are we not aligned on lexicon? What are some of the gaps and what are some of the discussions that still need to happen? What you see here is an image from the manuscript that has been prepared and submitted that addresses this very important topic. And what was done is disentangle all of the components around digital measures, the digital health technology that collects the measure as a data acquisition tool, the measure that results from it, the algorithm that analyzes it, as well as the biomarker, the clinical outcome assessment that is classified under, and then was validated, the endpoint that is being studied in the trial. We took all of these different components, had a look at the different glossary based on BEST, as well as other glossaries, and building on the work that DIME has done. And also we're proposing areas where we need more work, such as the word monitoring. It seems such a good word, but it brings a lot of questions if we consider that we're also bringing two regulatory frameworks together, such as the medical device and the drug development framework. So I'm very excited about this discussion, about the fantastic panelists we have here today, and about disentangling this topic with them right now. So Jen, over to you to present our panelists.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lada. And we have a really exceptional group of experts here to talk about this topic of a common unifying language today. And I think having folks from regulatory agencies on both sides of the Atlantic, from the life sciences, and from one of the leading digital health innovators is really going to serve us well today. So I'm going to, while I could give each of you an introduction that would make your mums very proud, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and also just offer some very brief remarks on why this topic is important to you. And Jeremy, I'm going to come to you first if I can.
Sure, Jen, thank you, and excited to be a part of this panel. My name is Jeremy Wyatt. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Actigraph, and Actigraph develops digital health technology solutions for use in clinical research, and our mission is pioneering the digital transformation of clinical research. That's what we do here. So obviously this topic matters deeply to me. And really, I think one of our key initiatives here at Actigraph is to see the use of measures, digital health technology measures from products like the ones that we make and others that we work with, be used for primary and secondary endpoints. We believe they're better measures overall. And so in order to do that, we have to see global adoption. And this is a global problem. This is not a regional problem. And so we're passionate about ensuring that we're aligned on the message here. And so I'm excited to be part of this conversation today. My background is in electrical engineering, so I'm very much a product guy. Spent a lot of time developing some of these tools that we now use today in clinical research. And so that's a little bit of my history. Thank you, Jen.
Fantastic, Jeremy, thrilled to have you here today. So we've heard from someone who's helping build these solutions, Carrie. You are part of an exceptional team that's really looking to deploy these solutions to improve the way that we develop new therapies for the patients we're all here to serve. Please introduce yourself and tell us why this topic's important to you.
Hi, my name is Carrie Northcutt. I am the head of digital sciences within Digital Sciences and Translational Imaging, or DSTI, at Pfizer. I am part of a phenomenal team that is really taking these digital tools, these sensors that are coming out, validating, verifying them, looking at creating new algorithms or using algorithms that are developed to measure physiological endpoints in clinical trials. So I work with a great team of people, statisticians, data scientists, clinicians, operations specialists, project managers, and at foremost in the front, the patients, to really make sure that these digital tools and sensors do what they're supposed to do and can really bring value into the studies that we're wanting to measure. I'm so excited. It's such a cool time right now to be in science because we're adding new tools to the toolbox. We're able to look at diseases in new ways at home while you're doing your day-to-day function, and understand these diseases. So hopefully we can develop better treatments and make people better. So it's such a cool time, but the key is to make sure that we have these validated tools that can be used, and these new measures are actually used accurately and well within the studies and science that we're wishing to do. And I'm can't be more privileged than being here today. So thank you for having me speak.
Of course, thanks for being here, Carrie. And then, of course, we need to make sure that we collaborate closely and chat often with our regulatory colleagues to make sure that the tools and the approaches that we are using are meeting the highest bar and the necessary bar to ensure that not only the tools themselves are safe and effective, but also the decisions they help us make about new medical products that might be molecules, for example, are also, trustworthy and that they are safe and effective. So Jonas, delighted to have you with us here today too. This is a topic we are both passionate about. Please go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us why this topic's important to you.
Hi, yeah. So I'm actually the Associate Director for Digital Health Technology. So right on point with what we're going to discuss today. And I'm in the Office of Drug Evaluation Science in CDER at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. It talked about global drug development, very near and dear to me, to just understand, all the different moving parts and, how they can work together to really push the field forward and make sure that we have safe and effective therapies out there. And digital health technologies possess a lot of potential. And I think that's my role here, to listen today, to engage, to realize, how we can better position ourselves as a field to unlock that potential and realize some of what the promise holds with DHTs. So I'm excited for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jonas, and delighted to have you with us today. And in the spirit of a true lingua franca that we can use to collaborate and advance sort of clinical science around the world, we're delighted to have a regulatory colleague from Europe join us today. Thorsten, please go ahead, introduce yourself and tell us why this topic is important to you.
Yes. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm encountering technical difficulties. I'm not sure you can hear me. My name is Thorsten Vetter. I'm scientific officer. Look into supporting the digital tools. I'm very excited. We had
Thorsten, we're struggling to hear you a bit. So rather than
conversations, very fruitful conversations with DMA, with EFPIA, with that
Thorsten, we did miss some of that introduction. So rather than ask you to repeat yourself when the connection may still be a bit unstable, first of all, thank you. Every digital health conversation does need a little tech snafu. So we've taken care of that right at the beginning. No, don't be silly. We'll wait for this to get stable. And then as we dive into discussion now, we'll ask you to do your introduction when you respond to your first question, but delighted to have you here. So we're going to turn to conversation, and as Sarah set us up, we're going to have a panel discussion, and we will simultaneously be watching the questions that are coming through the chat. We can address them as they come, and we will have open discussion at the end. We'll start, Carrie. I'm going to come to you to get us started. All of us here on the line share a passion and a real commitment to this notion of a common unifying language, and believe deeply it matters, but we shouldn't assume that it's clear why that's the case. So you and I have sort of sat in meetings, for example, and watched debates over language suck almost all of the oxygen out of the room. It's impossible to move the science forward when you're arguing over whether something's an apple or a pear. And, there's a point at which not only is that frustrating, not only is it consuming resources, but it's not the best for the field. Give us an example, talk us through some of your experience of when language has, really mattered in the work that you are doing.
So I'm going to go to the go-to one, Jen, that you and I've had forever, and I can convert another 100 people into using the proper language, I hope. So where this all started really was where we started talking about itch versus scratch. So a number of years ago, I was asked, my first role within the space of digital sciences is, can we measure itch using a wearable sensor? I sat and I thought about that. And I'm like, no, we can't measure itch because itch is a feeling. It's how you feel. It's an impression. It's important to know. And up until now, that's the one thing we could actually capture because we could ask people how itchy they were. But using a wearable sensor, I'm not measuring itch. I'm actually measuring a physical reaction, in this case, scratching, which is the action that occurs sometimes in response to the feeling of itch. So while they're related concepts, they're not necessarily the same. So I'm not measuring itch, I'm measuring scratch, which is a huge change for a lot of people, but it's really important to understand. Both are important to capture because I want to know how itchy you are. But what I'm doing with a digital sensor is actually measuring the action of scratching. And again, why is this important? I said they're related concepts. They are. Oftentimes you feel itchy, so your response is to scratch. But you can feel itchy and not scratch. I can wear long sleeves. I can actually prevent myself from the action of scratching. Or oftentimes I'm sure some of you in the audience are doing this right now. Me just talking about scratching, you're going to notice that you're automatically just doing it. The word association, it just happens. There's some great research on that. That's another day, another talk. But so you can scratch and not feel itchy. So why is this important in the context of measurements? So when I'm wanting to look at a disease such as atopic dermatitis or eczema, one of the underlying aspects of that disease is the scratching that occurs because that's what's causing skin perturbations, that's causing infiltration of bacteria, it's perpetuating the disease. So now that we can measure that and understand that, we can quantify it, which is such a cool thing to be able to do. And so I have this new ability, and if I call it itch, I'm not actually calling it the right thing, and that's confusing to others. So it really is a campaign to use the right language for scratch versus itch. Similar concepts, related, measuring different things. And that's kind of where this all started. And you and I, we had debates. We watched this happen over and over and over again. And it's kind of a laugh because I'm told now, oh, you're the scratch lady. You talk about that. But it carries across in so many different areas, even just the word data. Lada, we had a discussion during one of the EFPIA meetings. We said data, and we said, well, what kind of data? Endpoint data, measurement data, raw data, where is it captured, how is it done? And those are really important as we go into designing clinical trials, looking at output, what type of things are regulated, what types of things aren't. So having that alignment around language is so key, and that detail is so necessary as we move forward. So I think you all heard my analogy. I spoke with the speakers and I said, I'm going to bring up peanut butter in all of this. So I hope you'll give me just a little bit of a leash and then I'll shut up. So if you've ever done the exercise, someone tells you how to build a peanut butter sandwich. Can you build a peanut butter sandwich? And someone has to explain that to you, and then you have to do the actions. When it's all done, you end up with this messy goop. Knives are in the wrong spot, or you had to use your finger to do it. Especially now that we're global, as Jeremy commented, maybe someone doesn't even know what peanut butter is. So if I'm in Australia, maybe I put Vegemite instead of peanut butter. And then I was just teasing Jeremy. He's my device person. And I said, hey, I need peanut butter. He goes, okay. He comes back with this really cool, crunchy peanut butter. It's like, oh, no, I wanted smooth peanut butter. And, I'm trying to make this sandwich. And if we don't have the right language and the right directions, when I go to present this work to Jonas or Thurston, they're gonna look at me and go, what the heck are you giving me? Especially if the pharma down the street is trying to build the same peanut butter sandwich and demonstrate that their drug works. And now they're looking at two different things. So having that alignment in the language and the right type of peanut butter and all that description is so important as we go forward.
Carrie, I love that analogy. And also the scratch itch example gives us the, one's a feeling and another one is a physiological response. And that opens a whole other series of conversations Lada, I'm going to ask you to lead the discussion for a time and really get into the issue of sort of biomarkers, COAs, and how important that is, and a deep understanding of language.
Thank you, Jen. And as you say, let's get into it, moving from peanut butter to the big elephant in the room, digital biomarkers. Jeremy and Jonas, that term has been now permeating large parts of our industry, naming conferences. What's your take on it? What is your perspective on the digital biomarker term?
Yeah, I'll start. The term digital biomarker has become a bit of a branding exercise. I think that it's sort of taken on a life of its own. But before we close the topic that carries on, I just want to say that there are so many examples around where the language issue matters. And it's important to recognize where we have done some good things. And I want to give credit to all the people that were author on the V3 paper that has put a language around things that, as a technology developer, to Jen's point around Dime's mission of being at the intersection of those two, things that we have done for years, but it's been difficult to translate it over so folks like Jonas can understand what we're talking about. So we have made some progress, and there's good things that are moving there. Digital biomarker is an interesting term, and I think when we think about things that are pretty clear, we're just digitizing measurements. It's a little easier. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to digitize blood pressure or glucose or heart rate, I know what I'm doing. I'm turning a measure into a digital measure, something that I already understand, some biomarker that I already get. But the problem with the definition is, with new measurements, I'm actually able to do a lot more. And it's not clear how you translate those things over to terms that people understand well. So let me give an illustration of accelerometry, which is a kind of our mainstay that we do here at Actigraph. This is a measurement that I can interpret a lot of different activities that are happening in a patient's life, from things that are very precise, like Carrie's talking about around scratching, to things that are more broad. For example, physical function, sedentary time. These are things that are not real well defined in the industry. And so when we start to get in there, it's a little blurry. But what I do know is that those measures are closer to the patient in a lot of cases than what we are doing today with traditional measures in clinical research. Those things are measuring how people feel and function. And if we look at the definition of biomarker in the best glossary, it literally says it is not a measure of how an individual feels, functions, or survives. And I have a big problem with that. I mean, if we're going to call what I do a digital biomarker, then I'm kind of stuck. And it's more like an outcome assessment in those cases. And by the way, if I want to be used as a primary or secondary endpoint, and I believe that's where we need to go, guys, I believe we're going to see a lot of efficiencies in clinical research. I believe the patients are going to benefit greatly from that. We got to get those two languages right, because FDA is going to look for a COA plus a biomarker to approve. And if you call this thing a biomarker, then we have a problem, right? I have a gap here. And by the way, EMA has a little bit different definition of what you call this thing. And so it's just challenging. We even see with the Mobilize D effort that's out right now, the IMI consortium work, they are calling the work that they're doing around measuring mobility. The definition they're using is an outcome is a biomarker. A mobility outcome is a biomarker that provides a quantification of each patient's mobility. And so that's confusing in and of itself. So we got a gap here, and it's a global gap, and it depends on the region you're in. But I want to fix it, because I want these tools to be used where they matter, not relegated to exploratory measures forever.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's fantastic that you're pointing out to these terms being established already for a long time in drug development and how we relate to them. And with that, Jonas, what is your perspective from a regulator view?
Yeah, so anytime a new term's introduced, we as regulators need to consider how it fits within our existing regulatory environment. And I'm glad to hear that everybody's using those tools as well. I've heard the best glossary come up multiple times, and just to kind of weigh the importance of that, it's like we've devoted a lot of time and effort into building and maintaining that best glossary. And from my perspective, have seen that the application of digital health technologies, that they fit within the regulatory context of how we approach biomarkers as they relate to drug development. So it might not be perfect, but the intent is there. There's lots of different types of biomarkers, whether it be prognostic, diagnostic, and what those mean in terms of prognosis or diagnosis as they relate to drug development, or sort of how we approach the submissions we receive, and we can find that as sort of guideposts to help us with our review, and found that we could layer on additional considerations reflecting the digitally derived aspect of those submissions and proposals. And to Jeremy's point, as these submissions get a lot more complex, I think the benefit that we have here at the agency is we can pull in subject matter experts as needed. So that's not to say, hey, we get a biomarker submission and it precludes us from leaning on our counterparts in the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment. If there are certain aspects of the submission that really point to the expertise in the agency that exists, that we need to have them weigh in on in terms of these reviews, there's no doubt that we pull them in. And I think the collaboration is very important. Much like here today, we're all collaborating in the conversation. That's always going on behind the scenes at my agency, and I can guarantee that it'll continue.
Thank you, Jonas, and especially that collaboration in this field, right? We're bringing so many fields together: outcomes research, biomarker development, digital technologies, all together to get us to measure better outcomes in our trials for patients. So it's great to see, as you're saying, that those silos are being broken, but also that we can actually understand each other and have that lingua franca that Jen was talking about. Torsten, one of the aspects that we realize in the work with the EFPIA team, and that Jen also alluded to, is actually the key impact of the lexicon is in the evidence that we need then to validate these measures, right? So validating a biomarker is very different from validating our clinical outcome assessment. Is there anything from your perspective, Torsten, from your regulatory perspective, on this impact on evidence?
Thanks, Lara, and I hope my connection is a bit more stable now. I think I fully agree with all of you and with Jonas that we are very excited about all the development, but I also agree it's an emerging field. We are all learning, we are collaborating, we are discussing, and we have to establish a harmonized terminology that really facilitates the communication between all the stakeholders, between developers and regulators in an age of global drug development. In the case of the EMA qualification of novel methodologies, which is the platform that we use to qualify digital measures, it is not so much a practical concern as any types of methodologies are channeled via this platform. So we have ample space to really clarify and discuss, learn, and establish conventions and terminology that hopefully clarifies our communications in the future. Clear language is paramount, in particular with a view to the concept of interest to be addressed by a digital measure. And what is also important, because you have asked about evidence implication, is a succinct, specific, and clear proposal for an intended context of use for regulators to understand the level of robustness of evidence that is required to be able to rely on measures when used to generate evidence for benefit risk assessment of medicines. In terms of evidence for EMA qualification, there needs to be reassurance that the digital measure complies with the applicable regulation of medical devices and IVDs, GDPR in Europe, and that the tool used has shown to work in terms of its technical validity, although these aspects are not in the immediate remit of EMA, and I know we will touch on this in our further conversation. So the fragmentations we currently have in terms of regulatory environment in Europe in particular. So if the digital component of a measure is merely an alternative way to measure an analog parameter, evidentiary expectations will not much differ from the analog measure. However, if a digital measure is used to measure parameters which have not been measured before, like, for example, the stride velocity 95 that we have recently qualified, justification of a new digital measure as such becomes much more important to support clinical relevance and ideally to show that the data derived by the digital measure provides superior information on how patients feel, function, and survive. And practical aspects, for example, the applicability in various age groups, children, elderly, and the ability to detect change will have to be characterized, not least in terms of clinical meaningfulness. So as we are all still learning, we clearly encourage developers to start the regulatory dialogue early, which facilitates also to have an agreement on the terms used and will have the potential for us to really agree on similar terms going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Thorsten. I really like how you come with an open mind to let's sit together and let's understand together what we have on the table, right? So let's have that open discussion and together also identify what those evidence needs. And absolutely context of use, one of the key aspects that we need clear agreement on at the beginning. Jen, I'm gonna give it back to you to understand how it links with your experience at Dime and the glossary with them.
Yeah, of course. And it's exciting to listen to this conversation today. And the spirit of collaboration and the focus on quality and appropriateness, you know, this is all about generating the necessary evidence so that we can trust these new tools and trust them to speed the development of new therapies to market to improve the care of patients. So there's a purpose to this. While I may be quite particular about things like grammar and drive people around me absolutely bonkers, you know, we're not here to hammer on language for no reason. And what I'm really proud of is that during this conversation, we've really focused on the patient. And in order to improve the way that we develop new medical products for patients, there has to be commercial value there too, right? It has to make business sense. It needs to be a yes and. And actually, Jeremy, you've recently partnered with a tremendous and very innovative organization who had the courage to put a very high quality digital measure and position it as a primary endpoint. And it was exciting to see the effect that that decision had on sample size, for example, which you can think about as speed to enrollment and, you know, time to market should the product turn out to be a successful product. Can you talk a little bit about that journey, what your experience was there and what your hope is going forward as a consequence of that work?
Yeah, absolutely, Jen, and I think that's why we're here. At the end of the day, I don't want to get too hung up on the idea of sample size reduction. I think that what I don't want to do is posit that digital health measures, that's the only goal we've got here. It's going to save money. Certainly that is a side effect. And I think it's a great side effect. We saw a 50% reduction in sample size in that particular study where this measure of physical activity and function was used as a primary endpoint. It was very exciting to see that. I think the skeptics look at that and say, well, you know, we saw that drug actually failed in phase 3. The truth is that the traditional measures that were used as part of that, the surrogate measures, the secondary measures, all aligned and told the same story. So we're confident in what that measure looks like and the fact that we're going to see great reductions in sample size and great efficiencies in the trial. Latest got some great data on that, and I won't get into that right now. But I want to challenge the question a little bit and just posit that this is really more meaningful to the patient. It's a better narrative. It's a better way to think about how the drug is touching the patient's life. And this is really the first time that we've had the direct insights into how a patient is functioning in their home. I think we can ask patients how they're doing, but in this particular case for this study, we know we have a direct measure of how they're functioning in their home. And this should help us bring better drugs to patients, period. And we see the benefits there. We see the potential where that's going. And that's why we get up and put on our boots in the morning. And on the oncology side, that's been a tough therapeutic area to break into because there's such a high focus on, you know, can I reduce the size of this tumor? But what we want to know is, how do we know that those patients are tolerating the treatment in a positive way? And I think that's going to become more important and prevalent. And as we get these things right, and as we put these things in place, we see and realize the true benefit of what we're going to be able to do there. Weight loss is another one, and we've seen this come into the limelight recently with Ozempic. But how do we know? We know they're losing weight, but how do we know that this is having a positive effect on the patient's life? Function has been, you know, relegated to the clinic up until this point. But we've now got an opportunity here to do much better, and we owe it to these people that are participating in these studies to do it faster, to do it better, and at the end of the day, have something that's actually meaningful rather than something that checks a box. So that's my opinion on where we're at.
Absolutely. And I think that we have the ability not only to move beyond these sort of tiny snapshots that we've been able to capture in the clinic and sort of measure the impact of health and disease on a patient's everyday life, but we can also now manage, sort of measure every aspect that's important to them. And so I 100% agree. This is what's really exciting. And once you can measure it, you can actually develop therapies that address those symptoms, right, you know, because there's a target now.
Yes.
So I love that. Carrie, let's keep pushing on this. You shared a little bit about the work that we did together on Nocturnal Scratch. Obviously, a truly novel measure. That's a facet of that of eczema that we just haven't been able to capture before. And I'll never forget being in that meeting with you when it was the first readout of the results from the patient interviews. And those interviews were with adult patients, were with their care partners, and it was also with dyads of children with eczema with a care partner who was with them. And just the way that a condition that frankly I had not really understood beyond a little itch had us all in tears. Tell us what you see beyond, in the work that you're doing in Nocturnal Scratch and beyond that. What's the promise of all of this? Why is it so important that we have a common unifying language so we can collaborate and so we can push?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Jen. One of the first things I ever heard was a patient say, I wake up with bloody sheets. I don't know why. Or, you'll have a parent that has a child come to the room over and over and over again. And we're told eczema, atopic dermatitis, it's just a little skin condition. But then you start talking to them. Had a teenager comment, I can't sit on the floor and then carpet circle time because the floor irritates my skin and I have to scratch, but I don't want to scratch because if I scratch, people are going to see me. And then I'm asked if I have some funny disease and people treat me differently, and how heartbreaking that is. And the impact not only on the person themselves, but their caregivers, their spouses, the people around them. And then where it hit me as a scientist and someone that's in drug development and been in this now for a while is we can help this. We can actually do something here. And utilizing the measure of scratch, we can actually first, everyone jokes, I say it's a I'm not crazy card. And they're like, what? I can go to the doctor and say, hey, I scratched 400 times last night and woke up 20 times. And they'll actually have numbers behind that. And then from a drug development point of view, I have a target. I want to reduce the number of times I wake up. I want to reduce the amount they're scratching at night. And so I have a way now to measure it. They have a way to know what's going on. And as physicians, they can see, hey, this treatment's working, not working, et cetera. So there's so much we can build and learn in this space to give back. But where the language is important is if I call it itch, I'm not measuring the right thing. And then it gets all confuzzled with other assessments and other aspects. So it's important to know what we're measuring. And then Jeremy, I can't echo more. It's about the patients. It's being able to reach out more too. So with these devices, one of the steps is are we measuring it? Are we measuring it accurately? Can we monitor change? 100% agree. But now we're actually able to access people we've never accessed before. So typically a lot of people that participate in clinical trials tend to be around city centers. I grew up 2 hours away from a large city, a half hour away from the nearest stoplight. I didn't even know what a clinical trial was until I got to college. And now we have the ability to actually access some of these patients because they can wear a watch. We can get this electronically. So first steps, hey, can we measure it? Can we do it accurately? Yes. But now we're in a position that the next challenge is, can we make sure they have internet? Can they get these things? And those are great challenges to have because we ticked this one box and now we have another one, but we made a step forward and we're continuing to do that. And that's what I'm seeing happening. And I'm so excited by that because we're now being able to look at bigger populations. Thorsten and others, you guys have mentioned pediatrics. I'm excited. So not only can we measure this in adults, I remember showing a device to my neighbor's 5-year-old and they were like, this is so cool. And they were so excited about wearing a device to understand how they slept. The parents were like, great, we're going to have insight to what's going on because they're waking up a lot and now we're going to know why and we can attack the problem. So I think that's some of the excitement we're seeing, and that scratch and sleep, you can carry it into oncology, into a ton of different areas. So Jeremy, you mentioned oncology. We're trying to reduce the tumor size. We're trying to make better outcomes, longer lives, but we also want to make sure those lives are better. That it's not just a matter of, hey, I gave you another month of life, but there was no improvement. I mean, you were sick and you were throwing up, et cetera. So we want to understand, we're hearing that from patients. I want to be able to go out to the mailbox. I want to play with my grandchildren. I want to be able to go for a jog like I did before. And those are great things to capture, but we can do that now with these different devices and understand that improvement in physical activity, improvement in gait, how they're moving, sleeping less sedentary. And we have those numbers that will help support that. And as you said, the goal to be is a primary or secondary endpoint. Because to me, that's really important. It's really up there with reducing tumor size in that aspect, because I want to be able to not just reduce the tumor size. I want to be able to get out and play with my kids. I want to be able to do more. So having that quantitative value to actually assess, and also these measurements, because they're passively collected. So if I asked you, hey, do you think you're running a fever? You're like, no, I'm fine. I'm okay. But there's going to be a point where you're like, okay, I'm really running a fever. What these devices, even a digital thermometer, is going to say, hey, I'm noticing you're starting to uptick in that temperature. Maybe what I'm hoping in the future is we'll be able to, instead of waiting until you're at 103 and saying, hey, I might need to give you some aspirin or Tylenol, I'm going to start to see it increase and maybe stop it before it gets to 103. So these power of some of these digital measures is we're actually getting an earlier insight into the changes that we're going to see before you see the actual recognition of the change in when I asked you a question. So I think there's we're starting to see this happen with the study that Jeremy was talking about. We're seeing approvals occur now with a 95th percentile stride velocity. We're seeing these become more and more to the forefront. And when you go back to the patients and you actually read the transcripts and you talk to them, these are things that they want too. So I think it's all coalescing and we're working really hard to bring that out. Again, but we just have to make sure we have the proper language around it so we can do this quickly and easily as we go forward.
And I couldn't agree more, Carrie, and I'm really glad that you and Jeremy have brought up opportunities in oncology. You know, with new generations of therapies, we're, you know, now saving people's lives and putting them in a position where they live with cancer for an extended period of time. So we owe them a good life once we are able to put them in that position, and being able to measure that in a way that is low friction is such a gift. There's also opportunities to use digital measures to say, hey, can we tell if someone is deteriorating, if someone is decompensating when they are on a therapy? So either we don't have to pull them out of a trial or pull them off the therapy that is most likely to save their life because it took us too long to catch it, and get in there with supportive care.
That's such an important point, Jen. I mean, we can't
Intervening early, yeah.
100%. And I want to turn to our regulatory colleagues, because actually you both brought up, I think, a really important point earlier that we need to interrogate further, which is, as we bring new digital tools in to deliver all of the value that we've been talking about in drug development, we start to force a meeting of two different sorts of regulatory frameworks, one that was originally intended for devices and another for more traditional molecular products. So, you know, Jonas, I'll come to you first, and then Thorsten, I'll come to you, because in Europe and in the US, the mechanisms by which this happen are quite different. Jonas, tell us about some of the complications you've seen and a lot of the success we've actually seen, particularly through the Digital Health sort of Center of Excellence in driving this lingua franca, not only across industry, but also within the agency itself at FDA.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out is, you know, I understand it can be difficult and confusing when terms have different meanings, depending on who you hear it from. I've experienced this in other domains within FDA in my previous policy development work. And I think one thing that is important when seeking that consistency is to ensure the right representation when having these discussions. You mentioned Digital Health Center of Excellence, the CDRH's Office of Strategic Programs, even their device evaluation folks. I just want to, you know, put out there for transparency's sake that, you know, our counterparts from CDRH actually aid in our review, whether it be a DHT coming in through a pre-IND or an IND, or, you know, as part of our qualification programs, or even through other forums that CDER hosts to engage with developers like CPIMS, the Digital Health Steering Committee that we've established as well. And it actually works the other way, looking at CDRH-led discussions, you know, CDER staff, we've been pulled into Q submissions, IDE reviews. So we're leaning on each other. And I think I talked about that in my earlier response to a question, that collaboration that occurs internally. And really, we understand that, we're searching for alignment when possible, consistency when possible, and making sure that, when we are putting our considerations into these reviews, we understand, what are we actually concerned about? And thinking if there's commonality amongst those concerns, it also is helpful where, when we're talking about the nature of each review, the approaches, where, there's things that we might not have considered. So having those communal discussions take place, very important to make sure that we do a comprehensive review of what we're seeing. We also do our best to define our terms within the context of any advice that we're giving. So it's clear not only when we're providing our thoughts to you coming to FDA, but also when looking through our regulatory history and advice and decision making to revisit the advice that we've given, the recommendations we've given. We know for certain, as staff moves on, we all hope that they grow and they proliferate. That, what did we mean in that moment in time? Revisiting those decisions and also creating space as well. I think that's important to point out. Things that we are saying today are right and appropriate based on the information we have in front of us. And in the future, if that information or variables change, we can move on from that decision making because we're dealing with new inputs, new information, new evidence to consider that might have changed, what we may have said a few years ago. So just some thoughts into, how we approach decision making to understand that, this isn't lost on us, that hey, you're conflating potentially two frameworks or more than two. And what we can do about that as regulators to assist with consistency.
Jonas, it's fantastic to learn about all of that and the sort of deep collaboration and the processes that are getting put into place. And while it's beyond the scope of our conversation today, that will also facilitate, that's laying the pipes for, gosh, if we ever want to bring some of these digital drug development tools and pull them through into the post-market, perhaps as monitoring tools, or maybe even at some point as, dose response biomarkers or diagnostics, that collaboration that you are doing now is going to serve industry and in turn patients very well. Thorsten, I'm going to come to you. There's a different structure in Europe. Tell us how you're handling this. How are you thinking about the intersection of, digital and devices with traditional drug development?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, it was good to hear Jonas, and I think FDA is in a way in a very nice position to have these different bodies in-house, so to say, which facilitates conversation. But I think there's full agreement and broad awareness amongst European regulatory scientists and reviewers that increased clarity is needed, and that relates to the language used to describe our developments as well for the appropriate regulatory pathways. As you may know, in the EU, there are different agencies and regulatory bodies involved in regulating medical devices, IVDs, medicinal products. The EMA in its regulatory science strategy to 2025 has fully acknowledged that there is a need for all regulatory players to increase their dialogue and collaboration to support the development of innovative tools. And the dialogue is on a good way. We have workshops, discussion fora, we have interactions in qualification procedures, we have a consultation pathway as part of the marketing authorization application process, but fully acknowledging there is still a lot of work to do. But I'm very happy to tell you that this communication, this conversation is ongoing. It is crucial for all actors to learn and to recognize differences and agree on the common language. And developers are in an important and clearly challenging place here at the moment, as they are the interface, in Europe at least, and need to try to provide documentation which is clear in the context of their specific regulatory interaction. In the process, regulators are exposed to differences in terminology. They learn and they can help to clarify proposals, ideally as part of early interactions to discuss evidence generation for qualification. We already see that these increased interactions between all stakeholders bears fruit, and in the long term, hopefully will help to agree on a unified terminology and definitions, which will then hopefully greatly facilitate communications as part of regulatory interactions.
Thorsten, love those comments. And I think especially pointing to the worked examples that you've already been successful with in Europe, having that, that qualification, that 95th centile stride velocity, and being able to look at what was the pathway, what was the process, what are the decisions that were made, the language that was used, right, in the in all of the documents that came out in support of that measure once it was qualified. I think there's an awful lot we can learn there. It's exciting to see that you're thinking about how do we apply those more broadly, and it's a good reminder to all of us on the line that we've got some worked examples that we should be referencing in order to keep things moving forward. Lada, we're starting to get some great questions in from the audience. Do you want to take us through those?
Absolutely, I will. Before going there, just to share, building on what Thorsten is saying, the other week we just had a half-an-hour discussion with other industry colleagues on are digital health technologies used as data acquisition tools, medical devices or not? So I think maybe that's the next webinar, Jen, that we can do together with this group, because it's one of the questions that keeps coming back.
There's definitely a whole series there.
So we have a great question from Michael Melamed, and he's asking about shedding more light on how to perform analytical validation of digital measures for a specific disease population that would be acceptable for the agencies. And for example, he's giving the example of gait features calculated from accelerated data that are usually validated using healthy populations. So how can we then translate that into the specific context of use of the disease? Thorsten, Jonas, or Jeremy, I see you're muted. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I'd love to hear what Jonas, his response to that is, but that's sort of the path of digital measures is, can we get evidence that this measure works the way we expect it to work? And typically the beginning for analytical validation is, after bench testing is on a healthy population, and that's where we'll start. And from that, that's just a beginning point. But the truth is, when we look at mainstream adoption, primary, secondary endpoints, it needs to go further. It needs to go into clinical validation, and that's expensive. And for a technology company, sometimes it's difficult. It's not feasible, and so a lot of times that'll happen through partnerships with sponsors and organizations that are, trying to have a similar goal in mind. And so that's typically the approach. But analytical validation is typically sufficient to have the device or product or measurement be used in a study as an exploratory measure. But Jonas, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. First, thank you, Jeremy, for giving me that space of starting from the perspective of exploratory, and that's really that's really important to harp on, because I think sometimes what isn't considered is if these tools are relied upon, it's in the context of drug development. And from that perspective, that carries a lot of weight, because that goes into our benefit risk calculus, or determinations of ultimately whether a therapy is safe and effective and ultimately available to market in the United States. And to be able to rely upon that, there's a lot of comfort level that needs to be built in. And it could come in stages, starting as an exploratory endpoint use in that sense. And as you delve into secondary and primary endpoints, it's very difficult to disentangle analytical validity from clinical validity. We're going to be very interested in how this performs in the interested patient population. And my best advice is, as you look to shift this forward further along into drug development, that the review divisions or the qualification program review teams, we are entertaining those questions, and from right now, I think it's best to say it's a case-by-case basis, because it really depends on the patient population. It depends on the performance of your tool itself. We may, we see everything that you may not even be aware of. That's something else to just bring to the table. So, if there's some concerns that we may have, it might not make sense from what you've submitted to us, but we may have some information or evidence, coming from elsewhere that could be informing our concerns there. We try our best to be transparent. And that's where I say, if you come talk to us and you give us very pointed questions, we will respond in kind. So I think that's my best advice is, if you have something and you have a given set of parameters, to package that together, formulate a question, come into us through the appropriate means, and then we'll look our best to respond and make sure that, again, we bring in the right subject matter experts that we feel is necessary to respond to that, because we understand that any advice recommendation we're giving at that point, if it's informing a drug development program, you will hold us accountable as well. So, it's not to say, hey, this is flippant advice. This is advice you can definitely re-reference yourself and leverage to get us to better explain our position or our thoughts on a particular question.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Jeremy and Jonas. So time has flown. We are at time. And before I start summarizing what I've heard, I actually prefer to give you the floor. So if I can give each of you the floor to say the one thing you would love the audience to take back with them, and then we'll give it back to Sarah to give us some concluding remarks. Carrie, can I start with you? What is that one thing you want them to remember?
These are new endpoints. We're just utilizing digital to collect them. So that's the one thing I want to get across. These are new endpoints. And I know, Lada, we put this in the paper we've drafted as well. We don't measure blood pressure via a digital blood pressure monitor. We just measure blood pressure. So I think as we move forward, we need to think of these really as new measures, and the digital eventually will go away. But remember, these are just new measures. They're just a new way to do it.
Thank you, Carrie. Fantastic message. Thorsten, why don't you go next?
Thanks. So language matters. And as the DHT field is evolving, it is particularly important to start the regulatory dialogue early, ITF meetings, qualification advice in the case of the European Medicines Agency, and to be very clear about the intended context of use of the digital measure as it informs the evidence needs.
Thank you, Thorsten. Jonas, let's follow with you.
Yeah, so piggybacking on Thorsten, I think focus on context of use. These are wonderful tools, lots of potential, but really define how you intend to use it to us. And then that'll determine our regulatory expectations, evidentiary standards that may be applicable to why you're interacting with us, the submission at hand. So my best advice for the audience is to really think about context of use and to use all the pathways you can engage with us to inform that. So when you finally want to feel comfortable submitting something to us, you put a lot of thought into that, not just at that moment in time, but thinking longitudinally of your program for developing your DHT.
Thank you, Jonas. And Jeremy, back to you. And after that, Sarah, if you want to take us to the end.
I think that success breeds success, and sometimes the formalities and languages lag behind, and that's okay. And I think that we should not lose sight of why we're doing this. And forget for a second about the disparity between the two languages and the regions. The movement here is genuine and worthwhile. And I want us to continue to press down this road of finding a path for these measures to replace these measures that are less meaningful to patients and that are holding us back from really developing drugs the way they should be made. And that's what we should all be focused on, accelerating that. It's taken too long. And so that's my takeaway.
All right, thank you everyone for joining today. A special thank you to all of our panelists, including our moderators as well. Jen, Lada, thank you so much. I want to share my slides here, and we have a couple of call to actions. First and foremost, please be a champion of language today. It does matter, as you've heard throughout this entire discussion, and so being a champion of that, how can you do that? First and foremost, please check out the Dime Glossary on our website, bookmark it. It's an incredible resource. I have it bookmarked, and it will definitely help with ensuring that, we're all speaking the same language. We're not just giving all kinds of weirdly formatted peanut butter sandwiches to our fellow colleagues here, right? In addition, keep an eye out for the manuscript. As mentioned, it's been submitted, so keep an eye out for that as well. If you'd like to adopt a shared language across your organization, we do have a course available through our Digital Medicine Academy. I'll keep this QR code up for a hot second here in case you're interested in checking it out. Otherwise, it is available through our website, so check that out soon. And finally, our next virtual journal club will be bringing Itch versus Scratch back into the discussion. So it'll be a great discussion on the study that we conducted where we brought that patient input into the development of these novel digital measures. So definitely stay tuned for that. But with that, we're a minute over. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, your morning, your evening, wherever it is. So thank you.